So this module we are looking at chapter 21, and we're looking at a changing global landscape from 1950 to the present. And what you'll notice about these last few chapters, 21, 22, 23, it kind of goes back a little bit in time, but we always end at the present. So after World War II, the world's going to enter this new era, and it's going to be shaped by what we call the Cold War. It's going to be shaped by decolonization, and it's going to be shaped by the rise and fall of communist governments. So as European empires are on their decline because decolonization is happening, we have new nations emerging across Asia and Africa. At the same time, the United States and the Soviet Union compete for global influence, while communist systems in China and the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, developed in very different ways. So this period asks us to consider, how did the collapse of empires, the spread of communism, and the tension of the Cold War reshape the modern world? So for this chapter, there's several learning objectives. You should be able to talk about these or think about these, kind of loosely answer these questions by the end of chapter 21. But when we're looking at this, the decades after the year 1950 transformed the political map of the world. European empires are going to weaken. There we go. And many former colonies are going to seek their independence. So some of these are like Vietnam, for instance. Vietnam's going to seek their independence from France. You have a lot of countries in Africa that are going to become independent because they're going to get rid of that European colonization. Even the United States, we played a part in this. We have colonized other nations. The Philippines is one of those examples. They are going to seek their independence before 1950, but that's kind of there's a lot happening in the 1900s with decolonization. So you have these colonies seeking independence, and at the same time, communism is expanding in Eastern Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and all the way into our hemisphere, into Cuba. And the Cold War is going to divide much of that world into rival camps led by the United States and by the Soviet Union. China also is going to emerge as a political force, while conflict in places such as the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, show that the post-war world would remain unstable. And these developments are deeply connected, and they help explain the political tensions and global divisions that still shape the world today. And after World War II, you're going to read about Europe and Japan facing the challenge of rebuilding. And Western Europe is reviving its industrial economies, restoring democratic systems, and begin greater economic cooperation. The United States, we're going to play a central role in the recovery through what we call the Marshall Plan, where we are going to give $13 billion to these struggling economies in Europe. And later, we are going to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. Japan also rebuilt very rapidly and became a major economic power in the decades after World War II, while depending on the United States for military protection. The Soviet Union also rebuilt, but it did so under a much more coercive system that relied heavily on state control and forced labor. And you'll read about why the Soviet Union chose to go their own path. They didn't want to have the influence of the United States on them by accepting U.S. money. And the post-war recovery made clear that the world was no longer centered on European power alone. So what we see in China, and I have this little propaganda poster from China for you, but communism in China developed differently than it had in the Soviet Union. So China's revolution was rooted more deeply in the countryside and among its peasants, and the Chinese Communist Party had already built support in those rural areas before taking national power. China also had a much larger population, less industrial development, and fewer modern transportation and educational systems than the Soviet Union. So at first, China followed a Soviet-style path of modernization, emphasizing centralized planning, heavy industry, and collective agriculture. But their leader, Mao, soon pushed China in a different direction through what's known as the Great Leap Forward, and that is an effort to accelerate development and create a fully communist society. So instead, this campaign led to catastrophe and also to famine. And it also created chaos and violence. So what their leader does in China, Mao, he encouraged rebellion even against members of the Communist Party itself, claiming that capitalist values had infiltrated society, and that was why everything was just going poorly. Young Red Guards attacked teachers, officials, and others seen as the enemies of the revolution, and violence spread so widely that the military eventually had to restore order. So China's Communist Revolution therefore brought both major social change and a lot of human suffering. Here's a map for you showing like the countries of the Cold War, and this is also in your textbook. So if you can't see it very well here, it will be in the text. It's embedded in chapter 21. But the Cold War, that was the central international conflict of the second half of the 20th century. So we have like two major world wars, right? That kind of defined the first half of the century. The second half is defined by the Cold War. And it began in Europe, where the Soviet Union sought security and control in Eastern Europe, while the United States and its allies promoted capitalist economies and open political systems in the West. Really, if you go back and you look at what happened immediately after World War II in Poland with the elections there, that's what's going to pit these two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, against each other. So rival alliances formed. NATO in 1949 with kind of the U.S. heading that up, and the Warsaw Pact in 1955. That is the counter to NATO headed by the Soviet Union. And the Iron Curtain, it's not this actual literal curtain that fell in Europe. It's just like everything that was kind of divided in Europe on these two sides of this metaphoric curtain, that became the symbol of a divided Europe. So although the United States and the Soviet Union never actually fought each other directly, we are going to see Cold War tensions produce major conflicts in places like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and even Cuba. And we're going to have like these hot wars that break out, especially like Korea and Vietnam. Those are the two that we talk about the most. And these confrontations showed us how rivalry between superpowers could turn local conflicts into like global crisis. So take, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That became like this global crisis because it brought the world especially close to nuclear war. Like we were right on the edge of having a bomb dropped on us, right? So by the late 20th century, though, the superpowers had built massive nuclear arsenals. Both sides understood that nuclear war could be catastrophic, which is one reason why they avoided direct military conflict. And instead, they competed for influence in developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And some of these newly independent countries try to remain non-aligned and resist becoming pawns of the US or the Soviet Union. So the Cold War also exposed tensions inside the communist world itself. Reform movements in places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland challenged Soviet domination, while like in Yugoslavia and China, they pursued their own paths. So Soviet suppression of reform really damaged the image of communism internationally and helped reinforce like Western claims that the Cold War was a struggle between freedom and oppression. I just want you to keep in mind though, democracies don't work everywhere. The culture may not be set up for democracy. Although we in the United States believe that that is the best form of government, it may not work well in other places where you have these long-standing empires and monarchies and the culture is just not accepting to democracy. So that's also a thing that you have to keep in mind. One of the most important struggles for independence, one of the most important global developments after 1945 was this word that I've kept saying, decolonization. So across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, you can see in this map here, especially, colonies are going to fight for independence from those European powers, and the process reflected the declining legitimacy of empire and the spread of these nationalist ideas, like we are a nation, we don't need a colonizer, we can be ourselves, and this growing demand for that self-determination. So dozens of nations emerged in the decades after World War II, and maps changed dramatically in the after 1950. We have so many countries that are like renaming themselves, borders being drawn. So European powers that have been weakened by two world wars, right? At the same time, colonial subjects increasingly rejected the idea that Europeans were morally or politically superior. Educated national leaders organized movements demanding immediate independence, often drawing support from broader populations. So we do have these nationalist movements, and they're going to vary widely depending on where they are happening in the world. Some use nonviolence and political negotiation, while others turn to an armed struggle. Some were shaped by religion, others by secular nationalism, socialism, or communism. In India, for example, you're going to read about Gandhi, and he promoted nonviolence, while debates over religion and national identity ultimately contributed to the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. So independence, you're going to read, it doesn't solve every problem. Many new nations face issues with population growth, ethnic and cultural diversity, weak institutions, lots of corruption, a lot of military intervention. And in some cases, those democracies do survive. In others, authoritarian rule is going to emerge, like dictatorships. Even where democratic ideals are spreading, democracy remains very fragile and uneven. So decolonization was not simply the end of empire, but the beginning of these new political struggles. It's a new nation forming. You're going to have issues. You're going to have struggles, right? You've got to figure out what's best for you. So by the late 20th century, communism had begun to weaken and collapse in many parts of the world, and this process unfolded in stages. So China moved away from the Maoist communism in the late 1970s. Popular movements overthrew governments in Eastern Europe in 1989, and the Soviet Union itself, it collapsed in 1991. And these changes are what ended the Cold War and gave rise to many new nation states. And really, we mark the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me scroll down just a little bit for you. So the history of the world after 1950, it's defined by a lot of dramatic political change. And this time period shows us that European empires declined, new nations emerged. The Cold War divided the world into two rival systems. Communism developed differently in different places. Communism in Russia looked totally different than communism in China, which looked different than communism in Cuba. Independence did not always bring stability, and the end of communism helped reshape global politics, but it didn't end conflict. There's still a lot of conflict going on in our world today. So the modern world was shaped not only by the fall of empires, but also the struggles over ideology, freedom, national identity, and the power that followed. So it's kind of, you can see these tensions that were still there and still present after World War II. They remain there during the Cold War, and even when the Cold War ended in the early 90s, we still have these struggles that we're facing today, but you can kind of understand, how did we get here from there? So from 1954 really set the stage for the political climate that we live in today, and that's what you're going to read about in chapter 21.